In this video, I'm going to talk about how to protect your models, how to protect them from those that would do them harm, essentially other users, right? When you build your model, you know how it works. You know what inputs should be, what reasonable values are for each of those inputs. But then you send your model out into the world and you let other people start using it. At that point, they don't know exactly how you built the model and they start to put values in. Some of those values might not be appropriate, right? Should a tax credit be 150%? Probably not. Should it be negative 50%? Also no. So how can we control our model? That way users can't break it. That way what they get out of it, the answer that they get is valid because they've put in reasonable assumptions into the model, so they're getting reasonable answers back out. So the way we're going to do that is through data validation. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do this, but it's basically a way to restrict users from putting in improper values. For example, if I come to my sales here and I say, let's put in negative $100 of sales, right? $100 of negative sales doesn't really make much sense. And so we get this pop-up that says the value doesn't match the data validation restrictions defined for this cell. We can retry. We can instead put in $500. That works, right? It was originally 450, 450,000. So let's go ahead and put that back for the time being. But let's see how that happens. So the menu we're going to use here, it's under the Data tab. Under the Data tab is Data Validation. Under the dropdown is Data Validation. So that's what we're going to select. So Data Validation pops up, and here you can see what we're doing. We're saying that our validation criteria is that the user must pick a whole number, right? When you first start out, if you haven't put any validation on, it's going to start out as any value. Any value means it's not restricted. The user can put text, numbers, whatever they want into the cell. We can add restrictions by picking either whole numbers, decimals, lists, dates, times, text, etc. So there's a lot of flexibility here. We're going to focus on whole numbers, decimals, and lists. So let's start with whole numbers. Once you've selected a whole number, now you can pick your criteria for it. You can pick between, not between, equal to, not equal to, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. So lots of different logical criteria. Here we're interested in greater than or equal to, because sales, they could be zero, but they're likely to be something bigger than that. How big can they get? Pretty much infinite, right? There's not going to be really any limit on it, so we're not going to put it between two numbers. Rather, we're going to say it has to be greater than a minimum of zero. So we click OK, and that's how we put our data validation on. Now, it's kind of a laborious process to put data validation on, right? You have to go into a menu, click data validation, etc. To make it a little bit quicker to then apply to multiple cells, right? In this case, we'd like to apply that same validation all the way across our row. What we can use is paste special. And you've used paste special with values, you've probably used it with formats. If you hit N, so Alt-ES-N allows you to select paste special validation. So it just pastes those validation rules without changing anything else about the cell. So in that way, I have now added data validation to my entire set of sales in this case. All right, so that's one way we can do it. Let's go look at a different example where we do a tax credit percentage. All right, in the case we're working on, the government wants to incentivize investments, right? Investments in new machines. And so they're going to give you a tax credit of 10% of the value of the machine you buy. All right, 10% is one value for that parameter. What else could it be? Could it be negative? What would negative mean, right? Negative 5% would mean that the government essentially charges you extra to buy that machine, right? It's almost like an extra tax on investment. Could they do that? I guess maybe, but I don't want to build my model to think about that. And instead, I want to limit the user to say it must be greater than zero. At the same time, it shouldn't be bigger than 100%, right? What would 150% credit mean? That would mean that the government is not only paying you back for 100% of the machine, but they're giving you extra money to buy things that they're going to pay for. That doesn't make any sense either. 100% is probably too high as well, but at least that's a reasonable upper bound. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into data validation. And in this cell, we're going to see that it's set to decimal, right? Instead of any value or whole number, we select decimal. And now we select between. All right, again, we have a big menu here, but we're going to set it between 0 and 1, right? 0 and 1, that's 0% or 100%, because as a decimal, 100% is represented as 1.00. So that's allowing for these decimal numbers, basically non-integers, and we can put a percentage somewhere between 0 and 1. Now, once we've done that, one thing that we want to do both with the sales and with the tax rate percentages is we want to give a user an idea of what a valid number is. Because if I come in here and I say, I'm going to type in 50, it works. Okay, what if I try 150? Ooh, it doesn't work. It says retry. I retry. Let's try 250. I don't know what's supposed to go in there as a user, so it'd be really nice to get some guidance. And so that's what, sorry, 10, doesn't want 10, but it'll take 10%. There we go. So what we want to give is a little guidance to the user. And that's what all these little red triangles are their comments that I've added onto these cells. The comments provide a little bit of instruction to let the user know what to expect. In this case, tax credit percentage should be between 0 and 100%. Sales to other customers, that should be greater than or equal to 0. So providing these comments or putting some instructions in adjacent cells will give a user an idea of what they can put in and really not frustrate them too much. All right, the last way that we're going to look at data validation is in the form of lists. And you might have seen this before, but sometimes you'll see cells with this little down arrow or drop-down menu attached to it. In this case, the drop-down menu includes March 21, April 21, May 21, June 21. Now, importantly, these aren't the 21st day of these months. This is just a special date format that gives you 3 letters of the month with the last 2 letters of the year. You can look at the custom date formats kind of in the number formatting options. But that's how I've chosen to represent this here. And importantly, it's pulling, though, from a list of values that I've called allowable values here. So let's look at what that does. So if we go into data validation and we go into list, when we pick list, we can select a range of values that are possible values. So you'll notice right now I've selected these cells from I8 to I11. All right, and notice though when I select them all, it doesn't have I8 to I11. It says valid months. What that is a named range. I'll go through this a little bit more in a minute, but let's just start out with a simple example where I just do I8 to I10. All right, so now you can see the range I've selected. I hit enter and say okay. Now that I've just selected this range right here, those are now going to be the 3 options that I have within my purchase timing. I can no longer pick June because it wasn't in the list I selected for data validation. All right, so that's the basic idea of lists and data validations. We can create this list, and then that's all the user can pick from. They can't pick, January, February, or December because those aren't part of the list. So you can really restrict users' options and how much they can put in this way. Now, let's put this back to how it was and put our named range back in there. And notice that when I select these 4 cells, as soon as I do, at the top in that menu, it changes from a range of cells to this named range that is called valid months. And that's because I've selected these cells and I have named them. And let me show you how I do that. So we have valid months in there. We hit enter. And now you can see that if I select this cell, up here in the top left corner, it says I8. That's the name of that cell. The next cell is I9. If I select all the cells, now up here it says valid months. All right. What I did to name this range of cells is I merely typed valid months in this top left corner. And that allows me to name this range. And now whenever I want to do analysis, I can always analyze valid months as a name, and it represents that range of cells. So for example, I can sum valid months, and I get an answer. The same way if I said sum these 4 values, I get the same answer. All right, so it's allowing me basically a shorthand way to refer to certain cells. You could also do something like naming maybe this cell, right? We can, instead of calling it B17, we could call it tax credit percentage. And now whenever I want to do a calculation, I could say, well, let's take the machine cost times tax credit percentage, and it'll multiply those 2 things together. All right. Named ranges are just merely a convenient way to reference certain cells that you're going to use a lot in your model. So it's not a bad way to think about your input cells or other different cells that you're going to refer to quite often. So that's where named ranges come in. They're kind of a tangential topic. The important thing here was data validation and controlling how your users are able to basically interact with your spreadsheet and making sure they don't put in input values that you feel are not valid and might break your model.